we're going to start now. Okay. Yeah, we're just gonna get started to wrap it all up for us today. It's kind of been a long day, but a good day, long good day. We have Lori Baker. So Lori's a seasoned professional aligning in business goals with users' needs since 2002. With a focus on delivering exceptional user experiences, she builds creative agile teams focused on using extensive research and effective collaboration. Lori's ability to foster collaboration across departments and address challenges head-on has led to successful projects and better working relationships. So let's welcome Lori. Hey,
I'm the last one. I don't know how everybody else is doing, but like I'm a social introvert, and while I love this, I'm a nap when I get home. So thank you so much for letting me come and talk today. As they said, I've been doing this work since 2002. I've worked in a lot of different industries. I really love this work and the people in this field. And I really love feeding people. So this was like going to be my point where I was like, and I brought brownies today, but we can't have brownies in this room. So I put them in the snack room. So if you're wondering who brought the gluten-free, dairy-free brownies, that was me. And actually, I was able to give this talk at Fathom last week, and I just love feeding people. I can't help it. Like, I get really excited when there are physical people that I can be like, look at what I made. And I thought that's kind of a good illustration of this talk generally. I don't have a gluten allergy. I don't have a dairy allergy. I love a challenge, and I want to find something that tastes delicious, that is good for a lot of folks. And that's really what any of this research does as well. So as a user experience designer and researcher, I research everything. And so I'm like, well, that was pretty good, but this brand of gluten-free flour is not as good as I want it to be. So I'm going to find something else. So I do that in everything. So let's talk about why inclusive research is important. I've talked a little bit about it already with brownies. I was also hoping for brownie points. This image that I found, I love the idea of this image because it shows kind of the root systems having a partnership. I have a link to this article in the slides that talks about creating old growth forests in 20 years instead of 200 years because the different varieties of trees are helping each other grow faster to improve the ecosystem. And I think that's what inclusive research does across the board. So I've heard from a few different folks that DEI efforts are going away, budgets are tightening up, there's a lot of layoffs right now. Sure. But I think it's important to continue this work. And the thing about the early part of my career, probably the first 10 years, I talked about what the value of experience design was, what the value of research is over and over and over and over again. And so being able to go into a company and say, this is really useful, and here are the things that we're getting out of it, is how I started building this practice. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. I'm white, and I identify as a woman, and I don't have a disability that I know about. And I don't think that people within these communities have to be solely responsible for this work. But there is a fine line between being an ally and a white savior. And so I am always a little bit nervous before I talk about this, but I'm hoping that I have an attitude where people feel really comfortable from these communities telling me when I'm not getting it right. So I am open, I'm humble, I want to learn more. If somebody has something that they need to tell me, I just want to be quiet and listen. And I have a great support network. So one person can't do this work alone. It really needs to be a group of folks. And the client that I developed this work with had a really supportive team that was invested in putting this work forward. And so after a while, you do get tired of hearing no a lot and hearing that it's going to be hard and being told, well, let's just hold off on doing this for a little while so that you can come back and be like, so I waited a couple weeks and I haven't seen anything. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep going. And feel free to give me information as we move forward. You're going to get pushback from people because I've heard it's going to take longer to do recruiting. It's going to take longer to get this project out the door. We had accountability on the team. And so at the end of the year, we could look and see what happened. And we did not find that to be the case. And so when you get pushback in different ways, you can go back and say, here's the data. I don't see where those timelines really increased, and here's the value that we got from it. I've also heard that this information is too personal to share or ask, because I typically ask about race and ethnicity, gender, and disability. And one of the sidelines, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, is how we started testing the actual terminology that we were using to ask participants for recruiting. One of those questions was, are you okay with answering these questions? And so folks said, if you ask the questions in this way, about 80% of people said I'm either comfortable or super comfortable answering all these questions, because my goal is to improve the experience. It's not to just understand what someone is and not give participants an understanding of how that information is going to be used. One of the ways in which we started this work was before George Floyd was murdered. That did help us. We were starting to do this work, but we didn't really have visibility in the organization. Once George Floyd was murdered, there was actually a company goal that said we need to be an inclusive workplace. We need to make our employees feel welcome. We need to have our consumers feel welcome. And so I just used that. I was like, here's our company goal. I'm just aligning to this company goal. So I'm assuming that's not a problem. And so we continued on. Employee questions, you can't legally ask employees some of these questions because of prejudice in the past. And so we organized it and created it to say, are you comfortable answering these questions? It's kept anonymous. It's really helping us in how we design this process going forward for employees. If they said yes, we asked them those questions. If they said no, we skipped all of those questions. One of the other things that we did just generally to capture information during the screening process, we'd ask those questions and then we'd say, is there a way that we can make this better? Can we ask these questions better? And at the end of any user research study, we'd say, is there a way that we can make this functionality more accessible? Now, sometimes you're going to hear things like, I want a charger with this feature. And you're like, that's okay. But we also consistently heard like the font is too small on the website. So that is an actionable thing. It's an open field. You can do analysis on it, but that's an actionable thing that was actually a theme across the research that all the researchers did for that year. And we got a little pushback as well because the company is like, well, if they know who it's coming from, we're a little nervous that people will talk about it and we'll get judged for it later. Because these terms are evolving, especially terminology around gender, and something that is acceptable now, gender and disability, something that is acceptable now may not be acceptable in 5 to 10 years. And so also saying that's not a reason not to do it. So being able to push back a little bit in that and have a position on that with the PR team going forward so that they can address those concerns as they happen. If you can't get through that way, saying, okay, but we're going to put it on all the blind studies that go out. We're not going to say that this is who it's coming from, but we're still going to capture that information. And you're going to offend someone. So whether it's within these communities, again, just be open and humble and listen. And also being able to say, I haven't necessarily seen that theme in the research, but I'm going to keep an eye out for it. And I will come back to you and we can have another conversation about it. That's leaving things open to make sure that you are truly listening and not just ignoring folks. You're going to get pushback from people that are giving prejudiced comments as well. And so I was interviewing a participant who made a statement about a community that was incredibly racist. And I thought a lot about how could I have better approached that? I mean, you can shut down that session, but I really wanted to let that person know. At the time, I just got really quiet. I didn't say anything and I just stared at them. And then I continued on because I was reading a script all day and I was exhausted. But I thought about how can I address this in the future? And so I came up with the statement, that's not been my experience at all, and moved on and trying to change the subject because I don't want someone to feel like they can make those comments to me and I will accept them either. So the benefit of having inclusive design, what are we missing out on by not having it? So there's a lot of opportunity within these different communities to learn, and not that everything should be associated to making money, but that is the best story for some organizations to talk about the value of the money that they're missing out on or the opportunity and the money that they could make if they were talking to these different communities. And if you think about even work around disability, curb cuts are great for people in a wheelchair. They're also great for people with rolling luggage, strollers, bikes. Voice tools are great for being able to talk back and forth to something when your hands are full, having Google Maps tell you how to get somewhere without having to consistently like print out something or look at your phone. Closed captioning is really helpful. If I am not clearly saying something, you'll be able to see it more on the bottom of the screen. So when we did this research in 2021, a lot of the pushback was on, would this take longer? Would it be harder to find people? About 44% of the people that we did research with identified as BIPOC, and 33% identified as disabled. I'll talk a little bit about some of the levels that we had designated for those different groups as I go on, but we were not finding that it was hard to find folks. And in 2021, we sent out a survey to 100 folks to just say, is this terminology appropriate? How can we improve this? And out of the 100 people that we surveyed, 73% of those people identified as living with a disability. In 2023, we surveyed 3,000 people and 60% of those folks identified as living with a disability. Our guidelines were looking for 30%. So this information is out there and accessible. But these are the different areas that are affected. So this one is from World Economic Forum, talking about the different areas in a company that affect racial and ethnic equity. I would say this is the same for gender and disability as well. We do work in a lot of these different areas. So how can we keep this in mind? I will also say employee networks are an amazing resource to touch base and do dry runs and make sure that your test plan is not biased, and run through it, make sure that you've accounted for different needs for different folks. Obviously, those folks should be involved in the design process early on. I think we've heard that throughout today. But it's also another opportunity to reach out and say, these are some of the questions that I'm asking. Can we make sure that we have this together appropriately? But I think we're missing out, especially in this economy when everything is kind of, they're not spending as much time with design. I think the opportunities that we have to learn from making sure that the research that we're doing is truly inclusive, it'll just help us learn in different ways. So the first year, the research director that I worked with at the time was running a study when I started with this client and said, I really want to make sure that we have a good mix of race and ethnicity and disability. And I took some time, and she said, I identify under the Asian category, but it's such a large category, it doesn't necessarily feel inclusive to me because my experience is very different from somebody else's experiences who identify within the category. And so I did some research on it. I was really surprised to find that things like the census, they just removed the term Negro in the last round of the census. And so I didn't really trust how the census have been put together to be truly inclusive. And so I pulled some information. I put together some different options. We improved how we ask gender, because a lot of the research vendors that we worked with only ask male, female, or choose not to enter. And that was just no longer relevant. And I said, well, I'll put these as templates in the tools that we use, and then it will be really easy for the researchers to pull that template and use it as a screener when they're recruiting for research. So our guidelines the first year were to have 50% BIPOC and 20% living with a disability. We did not have specific disabilities outlined. It was just generally living with a disability. So the vendor, one of our research vendors, came back and said, why can't you just use the terms associated with the census? And the way that our contract is written, you're out of compliance with our contract because it's harder to recruit folks and it's taking extra time, and we need to build that into our contract next year. So we're going to need to charge you this much more. Since we were accountable on the team and the researchers were keeping track. Now, to be fair, it's very manual to keep track. It's an Excel spreadsheet. There is not an easy way to keep track of this right now, although I hope all of you will go back to the vendors that you work with for research and say, wouldn't it be great if you did reporting on all the people that we pulled for this year and we could see how inclusive and diverse that research was? That would help, because only one person saying it doesn't necessarily make a difference. So we did pull all that data together. And when I looked at it, I was like, actually, the race and ethnicity for participants, you said that aligned with the census. That doesn't look like it's the case. According to the data that we have here, you're out of compliance with the contract that we signed with you. So how can we both get to a better place where we are both closer to center? And so the outcome of that was their participant pool got a lot more diverse. And then we found a way to compromise to be able to pull disability and see that information without it potentially costing us additional money. But when they challenged us, one of the other questions is, we are researchers. So why don't we do research on the terminology that we're using to make sure that it is inclusive for folks? And so that led to us running a research study. And that was 100 participants on one of the tools that we were using to just see how can we improve how we're asking people these questions. And it was, right after, it was probably the fall of 2020. And one of the questions that I asked, just to understand how eloquent people were what's something good that came out of COVID. And a lot of folks living with a disability said, companies finally recognize that I can do work from home and provide value instead of feeling like I have to be in an office. I didn't expect that. It was huge for me, at least, because I hadn't necessarily thought of those things. And so that also affected how we looked and did research after that. So in years 2 and 3, we improved the terminology. We changed our recruiting goals to really be aligned with what the census had out there. And we also changed it to be specific for folks living with a disability, to outline. I worked with the accessibility team to do this, to outline if this feature or functionality is being developed, we need to recruit for these disabilities, and we need to have at least five or six folks so that we can understand if that theme is consistent across those folks. One example is we did a email campaign where we were sending out email to folks who had purchased an appliance and had it installed and delivered, or had it delivered and installed. And they talked about how people really couldn't access those emails. They were having a lot of returns, a lot of problems where they'd have to reschedule the installation because they were missing something, or the appliance didn't fit because it hadn't been adequately measured. And so when we ran the research for that, we ran a diary study where we sent all of the information that we would have sent to customers on the days they would have received it for the most common delivery and installation package. And half of the participants we recruited had a communication disability of some sort. So when we got to the end of that experience, I could pull up those folks and say, did this group of people have more challenges with these communications than anyone else? The challenges were the same, but my confidence was greater. And so when I put the report together, I could see, we recruited for all of this. Overall, there is too much content. You need to put what they need to do as the first thing. You can give folks access to the rest of that data, but you have to pull the rest of it off of that page, because it becomes, I'm seeing the same communication over and over and over and over again. So that really improved for that specific study, how how we communicated with folks. The guidelines and testing for terminology in this initial survey, we asked folks, how often should we look at this information? And they were like, well, every year, because things like gender are constantly changing. And so we need to make sure that we're accounting for that too. So when we did this work, I presented it throughout the company in a lot of different places, which was awesome because we had a lot of buy-in, but we had a lot more visibility. So when we went back around to do the second round of the second survey, and we got access to a tool that would allow us to recruit for 3,000 folks, which felt great. It just took a lot longer to get it up and running because everyone's really interested. They want to see how it's going, et cetera. And then when we did that survey, we made some improvements to terminology as well. So we improved how we asked race and ethnicity, gender, and then we switched it from disability to assistive tech because that was more appropriate for an e-commerce platform and how they communicated with customers. And what we also found is disability can be a lot of different things. It can be permanent, it could be situational, it could be temporary. And I use a lot of assistive tech, and I've never been diagnosed with a disability other than I wear glasses. So it opens up the field quite a bit more. So when you're creating an inclusive research practice, the best way to go out about it is to create partnerships within the organization. One, so you have support when you get tired. You can talk to the accessibility team. They can help you put that information together. I actually presented the reports to our vendors as well and said, listen, my goal isn't to hold your feet to the fire. My goal is to partner. And so when we came back around to look at all the information, they had actually done some of their own work as well and could share it with us. And so we could just more broadly learn on how we can improve this experience. I also worked with our employee resource groups, HR, PR, and legal. And HR is great because it's a lot easier to ask consumers about some of these terms versus employees, but you can utilize what you learn with consumers for employees, so it can improve that experience as well. And then measure, make sure that, or outline recruiting goals for your team so that you actually say, this is my expectation, and make sure that you're measuring it and holding people accountable, because people can make a lot of statements, but if they aren't accountable for it, nothing will happen. And then measure to look at this data. You can look at it by the study. You can look at it overall, the studies that you've run for that year to just see what are some of the themes that are coming up. And sometimes that leads to conversations on researcher bias as well. Some of those things start to become visible in terms of how people are using it or they aren't. And you do have to tell the story to show the value. So at the end of the year, what's the data that you have? How can you tell that story for the product team, for executive level team, for the directors? So you can say this work is important. We need to keep moving forward in this way. But if you have concerns from the company about recruiting goals, like something will take longer, don't have them for that year, but measure it and say, okay, at the end of this year, I'm measuring all of this and I'm going to come back to you to say, yes, it was hard to recruit, or no, it wasn't hard to recruit. So let's make sure we make those changes. Because every year someone would tell me, this is going to be too hard. And I come back and be like, this is the data. I don't see the difficulty. So now I'm really going to push it because the data proved that I'm right. And then again, use it for blind studies if they are concerned about corporate perception of that. So within each study, you can identify what assistive tech should be prioritized. It's usually a grouping of different types of assistive tech. So if you can have like, this is our number one, we're going to try and recruit these folks if we can, but we really need to learn from this one. Using an inclusive screener, ensure that folks using that assistive tech won't have issues participating. You can easily find that out in a dry run and with an employee research group, and then keep learning. Everything that we do with research, you learn something new and you change behaviors. Once you know better, you do better. And then in analysis, after that data specifically is tagged, just slice and dice a little bit to see if there are differences among those different groups so that you can confidently say there isn't, or you can say, this seems like it might be an issue. We need to potentially do more research on this. So what I've learned, what I think has gone really well is we have more rigor and standardization of recruiting practices. It improved the participant pool. It improved visibility and awareness within the organization. It increased confidence in findings and recommendations. And we continue to learn from each study on how we can make an experience or feature more accessible. I did run holiday research a couple of years ago. And one of the things that came out of that, because I paired both online research with in-store research, so I could see how those systems work together, is we learned that, the stores were putting all this really popular product out in the aisles and blocking the aisles from people potentially using a scooter or a wheelchair to get through. We also learned that there's all this contextual help in the store, but when the store got really busy, a lot of their systems shut down, or there wasn't great cell access in the stores. So you lose that assistance if you have tech problems. So what's the point of offering all this additional stuff if people can't access it? And the opportunities is we need more rigor and standardization in the analysis and design recommendations. Learning to evolve on how we ask the questions, keep uncovering blind spots, keep improving research methods, and find better ways to do reporting so we don't have to do it all in Excel. So I want everyone to have access to this. I'm happy to send you this presentation. I'm happy to send you the screener that I developed and the spreadsheet of assistive tech that I developed for an e-commerce company. If you click on that, that's contact information for me. I'll even give you a free hour of my time once a week to present this document and answer any questions for any research team. That's how important I find it. I want everyone to be able to do this so it becomes the norm, whatever that means, because normal is not a thing. If you're concerned, you need help, you want additional research, I have actually thought about, I don't really feel comfortable taking money for this and I want it to spread more broadly. I don't want to be a gatekeeper in any way, but I am not made of limitless dollars, sadly. And so I did also put together a couple of packages where I feel really comfortable providing ongoing support, and half of whatever I make from these packages goes back into the community toward education, for these different communities toward education, because I don't think that I should be the sole person benefiting. I want equity to be improved so that more people can do this work. So that's my presentation. Does anybody have a question or two? Do I have time for a question or two? Am I way over? Okay. Question or two? Yeah, go ahead. Disability. So we do identify, they were identifying branding from that specific company, and people would often say, why do you need to know this information about you? It made them nervous. And we often, in the screener, I have a lot of blurbs where I'm like, I promise we're collecting this. And I restate the blurbs a couple of times to say, we're really collecting this to make inclusive experiences for everyone. It's not going to kick you out of the study. People were more comfortable with assistive technology and it was more relevant. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. I think take this screener and start using it. And it's a very simple thing to do. Yeah. Yeah, demographic is only a piece of it, right? So it also needs to be the research practice as well. I think that takes conversation and practice. I think with any study or design that you're doing, you kind of need to have a moment where you say, could this do harm anywhere? What harm could it do? Are we thinking about some of these different communities? Even just having in the screener, we kind of have a checklist of assistive technology, just going through that and saying like, this might be problematic here. This may work really well here. That can determine both who you recruit and how you think of the study itself. All right. That's it.